Good evening, and welcome to the second installment of How Do You Solve a Problem Like Mikado, co-presented by Intermountain Opera Bozeman and the Bozeman Public Library. My name is Michael Saker, and I'm the Artistic Director of Intermountain Opera Bozeman. Before we get started, I wanted to offer Intermountain Opera's sincere thanks to the co-presenters of this webinar at Bozeman Public Library, and especially the library's Head of Adult Learning and Outreach, Corey Sloan, whom you'll hear from later tonight. Also, before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to recognize the importance of this day, the birthday of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King's legacy of fighting for greater equity is just as important and relevant today as it was in his lifetime. His work and vision inspire us at Intermountain Opera Bozeman and the Bozeman Public Library to help create a more inclusive and equitable world. In May of 2021, our opera company hosted a gathering of local community leaders, opera board members, and faculty from Montana State University to address the question of whether we should produce Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. I'm proud that everyone at that meeting came to the same conclusion. Gilbert and Sullivan's original 1885 comic opera was no longer fit for public consumption. It misrepresented traditional Japanese culture with offensive character names like Nanki-Poo and Yum Yum, not to mention a plot that minimizes ritual suicide and samurai culture. As we learned at last week's webinar, the Mikado's appropriation of, quote, Japanese music was another serious distortion of East Asian culture. Add to that centuries of white performers portraying false and harmful stereotypes in yellowface. And everyone at that meeting last spring agreed that the original Mikado was too problematic to present on today's opera stage. Instead, our own Sarah Allen, who you'll hear from tonight, had the brilliant idea of embracing the original Mikado's satirical origins, making fun of 19th century Victorian culture, and create a new satire making fun of Bozeman today. The result is the Montana Mikado, which Intermountain Opera Bozeman will present at the Ellen Theater on February 4th through the 6th and 11th through the 13th. Bozeman's own Soren Kissel has written a new and absolutely hilarious libretto with the same music from Sullivan's original score. It's going to be an unforgettable night, and I encourage you all to buy tickets now. But we at Intermountain Opera Bozeman didn't want to just ignore the problematic history of the original Mikado. Rather, we wanted to use this production as an opportunity to enrich our community with educational opportunities addressing representation in opera. And that finally is where tonight's webinar comes in. Sarah Allen has crafted this series to help us all appreciate the biases, stereotypes, and discrimination that are part of the original Mikado and that are sadly still a part of our society today. Sarah is an assistant professor in the Department of Family Life and Human Development at Southern Utah University. Over the past 20 years, her research and teaching have centered on diversity training along with individual, family, and community health and well-being. She's on the board of numerous arts organizations, including Intermountain Opera Bozeman, and has a passion for the arts and its capacity to positively transform individuals and institutions. We're also joined by tonight's very special guests. Maestro Norman Wynn is certainly no stranger to Bozeman as the music director of the Bozeman Symphony. And mezzo-soprano Kimberly Sogioka joins us from New York. Kimberly will portray the role of Madison in Intermountain Opera's upcoming production of the Montana Mikado. Sarah, Norman, Kim, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael, for that lovely introduction. I'm so excited for this evening and sharing the mic with Norman and Kim. Just by way of introduction, let me get to our opening slide here where we're looking at the roadmap of where we hope to go in the next 60 minutes. We're essentially going to focus on 4 core questions. What is the model minority myth? And then what's problematic about it? And what are some of the implications or costs of that myth? And then we want to end in sort of a positive, sort of action-oriented mindset where we can start thinking about how we can better support Asian American families in our community. But before we go there, I want to just sort of set our learning intention for our time together. I wanted to first start by recognizing and honoring all of those who have suffered and or lost their lives in association with this most recent uptick in anti-Asian American hate. The FBI came out with numbers in October of 2021 indicating a 76% increase, and the Center for the Study of Hate Crimes and Extremism noted increase between 2019 and 2020 of 149%. So those are real lives and real people and real suffering. So I wanted to recognize and honor those. And then also extend my deepest gratitude for all the scholars whose work I am citing in this presentation. And that whenever you see something in brackets, that's our academic thank you note for all the excellent research that sadly I'm not producing, but I would like to share with you. And so this is not an exhaustive representation, but these are some of the scholars whose research has been incorporated into this presentation tonight. I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Shaw, Dr. Wang, Dr. Shi, and Dr. Oops, sorry, my screen is covering up, Dr. Chang, who are part of the National Council on Family Relations, who have created other webinars that have talked about the myth of the model minority and whose scholarship will be cited tonight. And then lastly, just want to invite us all to sort of engage with our positionality. We all have multiple social identities, and based on our race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, we're all going to be coming to this conversation from different perspectives. And that positionality influences what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know, and what some of our blind spots might be. So where we might hit a speed bump or a roadblock in our learning, sort of leaning into the curiosity of how our social identities are informing our response to the content that we're going to be exploring tonight. And on that note, I want to sort of lean into this idea of creating a brave space together. On that roadmap, you'll note at the very end is a Q&A section. So we're going to have some hopefully lively discussion at the end of this presentation. And just as a tip, I know sometimes you have great questions as we're going through the webinar and then you forget them by the end. So please just type them in as you go. We won't be able to address those questions until the end, but go ahead and start typing those into your Q&A function at the bottom of your screen whenever something arises, so that we can address those at the time when we have set that apart. But when we think about creating that, when we're talking about race, it's often it makes people nervous sometimes, and there's some anxiety and some panic, and you're not sure if you know what the right terms or the right words are. You might say something inappropriate, and actually scholars have studied this, why it's so hard for white people to talk about race. And so I just invite you, if any point in this webinar you find yourself running into that fear zone, so you're already out of the comfort zone, because webinar folks love to learn, so you're already out of your comfort zone, you might hit the speed bump of fear, like you might become angry or defensive or feel shame or guilt. Those are all very normal responses. I invite you to just keep on pushing yourself into that learning and growth zone, because that's where all the magic happens. So I'm just inviting you to bring your best self, your best questions, your best intentions to this space. Get comfortable feeling comfortable. That's where all the good stuff happens. And enter with an open mind, because that means you have an open heart. So with all of that said, we're going to hop into our very first question, which is, what is the model minority myth? And so this was a term coined in the 1960s by a sociologist named William Peterson, and with the intent to describe the achievement of Japanese Americans who were able to rise above the hardships of the World War II internment camps. And there's lots of different components to it, but they sort of constellate into these kind of themes of hardworking, submissive, homogenous group that is economically and educationally successful and is excelling financially and professionally. So that's a lot of stuff right there that we could unpack as to that myth. But there's also this element of the problem-free immigrant, that hard work and determination has enabled them to bootstrap their way out of hardship and into success. And then it sort of assumes then that they've overcome hardship and oppression and discrimination. That's all kind of in the rearview mirror. So we're going to unpack all of that a little bit, but just to provide it just a little more context, I'm not going to share this video with you because I'm concerned about user end issues with Zoom and live streaming and all that kind of stuff. This is a great sort of connection point if you were with webinar 1, looking at representation of Asian Americans in art and film and movies. This is a nice sort of connection point between how did we go from sort of these representations of Asian Americans as villains to be feared, all the way to this model minority sort of ideology. This was the cover of Time magazine in the sort of late 80s. So how did that happen? And We don't have time to cover the intellectual history or that, but there's a whole book. So you can read Dr. Wu's amazing scholarship in the origins of the model minority and the historical context and how that all happened. But I do want to just pause before we go to our, another part of the model minority myth that we're going to look at more closely tonight is these 3 elements. So the idea that Asian Americans are model students, they get good grades, are respectful and trouble-free. 2, Asian Americans earn more money than other ethnic families. And 3, particularly for the immigrant experience, they assimilate very well and they're sailing off smoothly after they immigrate to the US. So this is sort of a little bit of a brief overview about what it is. I just want to pause and just check in with Norman and Kim if they want to sort of add anything at this point before we start unpacking like what's problematic and some of the costs of that, but anything you might add or that you wanted to mention that are sort of parts of this myth.
I'd be happy to say a little bit on that too. Part of that is also that the idea that Asian Americans are silent as being part of the model minority. You're not going to raise issues. You know, the Japanese Americans, most of them wanted to be helpful to the United States, and a lot of people went willingly as part. I mean, they were taken advantage, but they thought that this was their duty for the country to serve in this way too. There was a lot of people that felt this way. There was obviously people that didn't, but generally it was a very peaceful relocation. And so part of that was what became part of the model myth, is that you can slightly, you know, I mean, these are hard words to say to, like, subjugate a little bit, you know, it's like, work harder, put your head down, don't say anything, don't cause trouble, don't bring attention to yourself. And that was what the government wanted and needed at the time. And so they were trying to, I think, reframe it and say, this is what you should do. These are the people you should be like because they don't cause trouble. Mm-hmm. And so it was helpful for them. And it was also in their way to reframe, I think, other minorities in the country that have been subjugated as well, and say, look, they did it, you should do it too. So you should be better at being an immigrant than, you know, because they were able to do it. So it's another way to use racism to also keep down other people.
Yes, so divisive, and we'll unpack that even more. Thank you for bringing that up, Kim. Norman, anything else you want to add at this point?
Yeah, maybe not so much about the model minority myth, but first just want to say hey to everyone who's watching. This is hard for me. I'm uncomfortable. It's never easy, even if you're the sort of race that is the topic of issue. I was just texting my friend who's also Asian American. I was like, you know, I don't know how to talk about being Asian. And she was like, yeah, me neither. I'm just Asian. And so if you're feeling sort of in a little bit of anxiety or nervous to ask questions, it's hard to even ask questions as an Asian American as well. So you're not alone.
Thank you so much for bringing that up and for being vulnerable, because it's a hard thing to talk about, I think, for everyone. And so it's just an opportunity to have a conversation and ask questions and learn together. So thank you so much for that. When we start unpacking what is problematic with this myth, it masks diversity, and we'll look at that in a little more detail. It has a high cost to mental and physical health, and it is divisive. And I think Kim was alluding to that. So we can chat even more in depth about that. And these slides are a little bit of a review from webinar 1. I know we have a bunch of new registrants this time around, so thanks for showing up. But when we talk about masking diversity, if we think about Asians are a diverse group of individuals with family ties to Asian, and as this map suggests, Asia is a very large continent. So, you could be from Eastern, Southeastern, Southern, Western, Central Asia. And so that really means we're tapping into at least 60 different ethnic groups who originate from Asia. So certainly they're not all going to have the same experience, and just putting them all in the same basket kind of radically masks a whole bunch of diversity. And even if we just look at the majority of Asian immigrants that come to the United States come from predominantly 3 of those 5, so East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And the sort of demographically speaking, the largest population groups are Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. But even if we just look at that, that's so much diversity in culture and language and history and socio-political context and economic conditions. And so again, just this idea that Asians are this sort of monolithic homogenous group, we need to think a lot more diverse in more diverse ways, a lot more complex ways, because it radically overgeneralizes, mass import diversity, and don't exist as a single monolith. They're not all the same. And so I'm going to check in again, and maybe Norman and Kim, if you can share just a little bit about your story and who you are, and sort of highlight some of the diversity when we talk about what it means to be Asian. What does that mean to you?
Kim?
So I'm 4th generation. I'm half Japanese. So my great grandparents came. So my great grandpa's brother came in 1906, and my great grandfather came in 1912. The dates seem to be a little bit different depending on who you ask. And so my grandpa was just out of high school. I guess he was finished with high school by the time the war happened. And but something he always mentioned during his high school years was taking the bus to school and seeing signs at the pool saying no, basically just whites only, and he couldn't use it. And that was something he grew up with, and something that he always remembered that struck him as he would go to school every day. He had to pass these signs. It was specifically a Japanese community, so it was targeted against him. They were interned during the war. They went to a Pomona relocation center, and then from there to Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my grandpa worked as a farmer. Green Giant was one of his employees. So he was able to leave Heart Mountain to work on different farms. And then after the war, he was able to go back to California, and he started a farm with his brother, and they farmed for, I even grew up on the farm, so they farmed for a long time until probably about the 90s when they sold it and retired. But yeah, so that's my basic history with that. And I realized, going through this and studying for this webinar tonight, I never put it together that my dad was born just after the war. And so I'd always put these things differently in my head. The internment happened. That was my grandfather's generation, his family, his parents. But I realized my dad was born in 1946. So just shortly after they were able to go back to California. I went to Manzanar as a student in elementary. And I did have a classmate who threatened to tie me up and leave me there because I was Japanese. Also did not say anything, did not cause any problems, did not put my hand up, say anything to the teacher. You deal with it, you kind of just brush it off and keep going. And so that's, I think, kind of how we were raised also. And a lot of communities become very insular that way when there's violence against them. Recently, it's hard for Asians. Like Chinatown, you say New York is very insular. You have your doctors there, you have your grocery stores, and your whole community is based right there. And so if something happens, you take care of it within the community. So it's only recently that people have been feeling safer to open up and say that this is happening to us, and we need to stand up. So these are important conversations to be having, and I appreciate this.
Thank you for sharing, Kim. And I think you also mentioned you have some distant relatives from Hiroshima as well.
Yes. So my family actually immigrated from Hiroshima, and some of the family was still there during the war. And so we actually have letters that were written between the internment camps and like after the internment camps in Hiroshima. Some of the relatives did not make it. One of them had to remarry because she couldn't afford to survive. So her husband was killed in the bomb. And I think the next year she was remarried because she had to survive her son and her husband. So I haven't met them. That's one of my goals, is to go and reconnect with some of the family there.
Amazing story. Where did you grow up, Kim?
I grew up in Southern California.
Oh, nice.
And I grew up in an area where I was actually the only Asian, or the most Asian, my brother and I, which is odd. So
in California.
yes, I was a little bit more inland.
Yeah.
But by high school, I met more people that were half as well.
Yeah, and people listening will notice very quickly that every person has a completely different story too. You know, this is all, whatever we say is just kind of our own individual story. For me, my mom immigrated here from Taiwan when she was in her early 20s. This is in the 80s. My dad is a refugee from Vietnam, so he came over when he was like, depends on who you ask. He says around, like, I think 8 or 9 years old is when he came. And so during the war, the Vietnam War, his parents, who had 9 kids, shipped them all over here through a boat. And my dad has all these stories about stopping on an island and having to climb the mountain to go just use the bathroom. But anyways, they ended up both of them in Florida, my dad in Pensacola, and I ended up growing up in Alabama. So I can relate, Kim, because I was one of very few Asians in Montgomery, Alabama. And so it's really interesting to just reflect on family history. And my parents came and opened restaurants, so I essentially grew up in a Chinese buffet restaurant, and I was the opposite of the model minority myth. So I was very loud and didn't make good grades in school. It took me about my senior year in high school to get serious, but I always had a talent and knack for music, and so that's where I found my passion. And but being in middle school as a little Asian kid is definitely hard, because you are picked on and called names by so many different, white people, African Americans. Everyone was just kind of, if you stuck out, it was boom. So it was just interesting to grow up in Alabama, and very, very different.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think it beautifully highlights, like what you were saying, Norman, everyone has their unique story. And the more you can dive into that and be familiar with it, the more it kind of breaks down this idea of Asian Americans as this monolithic group. When we're going to dive into each of these myths a little bit in more detail with some pause points to hear again from Norman and Kim. But the first one we're going to look at is this model student. Good grades, are respectful and trouble-free. And I'm so glad, Norman, you shared that you already broke that myth, that you did not fall into that bucket. But when we start thinking about how does that myth or that stereotype, how could this potentially hurt Asian American community members? It really holds Asian American children and students to high standards, expected to work harder, and that can alienate them from their peers and or coworkers in the future. and issues may not receive as much community support. So if you have a little kiddo that's struggling in science and math, and the myth is that all Asians are really good at science and math, that teacher might not leverage resources or tutoring soon enough or quick enough, because they're just like, well, you just need to try harder or something like that. And so it puts, and these are some really sobering statistics, but that internalization of having to achieve better academic performance places an undue burden on their psychological well-being. If we look at suicide rates, it's the leading cause of death for Asian American young adults aged 20 to 24. So those are those college-age students. Second for youth aged 10 to 19, that elementary school, middle school, high school. And then 25 to 34, that's post-career, right after graduating. And so that's a really sobering statistic. And paired with that, of all racial groups, Asian Americans are the least likely to seek help from mental health professionals, which puts them at an additional risk and limits access to services that could really target or help. And so I think part of this is if there's this story that you're always a good student, always getting good grades, you don't have ownership of your own individual story. You're always having to comply with something else. And I love this picture because it just sort of communicates, hey, this is my story, my identity, my narrative, not yours. You can't sort of superimpose that on me. I want to have the freedom to choose who I want to be and how I want to be on planet Earth, instead of having to comply with this model myth. So we're going to check in again to get some feedback or stories about this component of the model student.
I think Norman already shared his.
Yep, broke that one.
Buster.
But it's there was one on there. Would you mind going back?
You bet. Yeah.
Slides?
The ones on mental health?
Yeah, this one right here. Because my parents, they were essentially, for me, my parents were working pretty much from, after school, I would go to the restaurant and they would just be working. So I had the opposite sort of, I didn't have the tiger mom or the parents who was like, you need to study. It was more like my mom was like, hey, make sure you don't get in trouble, because if you go to jail, I'm not coming to pick you up. Yeah, it was like that. You're on your own. And it was because it's like, I don't have time. And so I was kind of left on my own to do a lot of things. But it's recently, because I've been the last year and a half seeing a therapist, because it's good for everyone. I recommend that for everyone. But it's hard because it's been so helpful for me. I'm thinking, gosh, how can I find a therapist for my mom to talk to? Because English is her second language. And so it's really hard for us to communicate on a really deeper level. And I'm thinking, well, is there a therapist that can speak in Mandarin to her or in Taiwanese to her? And but for us, it was always, we just never spoke about feelings or it was always in our household just kind of like, hey, it happened, don't worry about it, just keep moving on. That kind of mentality. And I think it comes from sort of the crazy hardship that they had coming over here. It was just, you had to take it day by day, and you couldn't worry about what happened to you or what's going to happen. It was just kind of like, hey, how am I going to survive and make money so I can eat, or for my family?
I was just going to also mention too that, grouping all Asians into one category, I mean, there's many Asian countries that had war-torn regions, and, their experience coming into the US is so different as well, especially, I mean, you look at the Vietnam War, you look at more recently, you have immigrants that come from such varied backgrounds that you can't just assume that you're Asian, you're going to do this and just put you in one category, and you're not going to ask for help. You're not going to require much effort as well. And so it is so different. Yes, everyone's experience on that.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll keep moving on. This second myth, Asian American families earn more money than other ethnic families. And the way to sort of critique that, what does this mask? This wide variation in employment status, household income, wealth, and poverty. And I think we've already alluded to this. So just brace for impact. This next slide is going to have a lot of numbers on it, but don't panic. Over here on the far right-hand side, you'll see just sort of a list of demographics, population density of these different ethnic groups. And if we were to all sort of aggregate all that data and just say, okay, the median income, household income for all Asians right here where I'm circling my cursor is 86,000 per year. If we don't disaggregate that data, we have sort of wildly inaccurate understandings of what is actually happening. Of course, we have some high earners, Filipino and Indian, that are kind of pulling that median in that direction. But if you look, a lot of those different ethnic groups are, anywhere from 44,000, 55, 61. And so to make the argument, if I go to this slide, you can see it a little more clearly. All Asians, their median income, 85K per year. And that's above the average US. But when you disaggregate that, you have a much more nuanced sort of understanding of what's happening there. And if you look at the reverse, like what percentage of the Asian population is living in poverty? Well, if you look at if we put everyone all in one basket, we could say 10%. Well, that's lower than the average US population, so they must be doing really well. But if we go back and we look at that lower, less than 10% is mostly representative of Indian, Filipino, and Japanese. And we have populations with much higher poverty rates, Nepalese, Bangladeshi, Burmese, Mongolian. And so again, the disservice it does to just kind of have that monolithic story to say, well, all Asians are doing just fine. And it also masks a lot of, some of the more recent jobless rates associated with COVID and some of the anti-Asian American hate that has impacted businesses, as well as the idea that households tend to be intergenerational. So if you have that as your household income, it's not maybe just mom, dad, and 2 kids. It might be mom, dad, and grandparents and cousins all living in the same household. So that same household income, when generations are pooling incomes, that average resources per person may be limited. So again, there's a whole nother layer to that. And some families are sending money back home to families that are living abroad in these transnational family structures. So, and the additional sort of component of completing more years of education to reach the same income level as whites, it paints a very different kind of picture. And also, if you think, all Asians are rich and they're doing fine, you don't pay attention to the employment discrimination that they're still experiencing. Asian American women, some scholars have termed this the bamboo glass ceiling, where they're very well represented at entry level jobs, but not at those higher senior level positions. Other data indicates Asians are underrepresented in leadership ranks of law firms, government, and academia, on executive officers and board members in the Fortune 500. And even though, again, if we go back to the myth of the STEM fields, that science and math in Silicon Valley less likely become managers and executives. So it just kind of reinforces that stereotype that racism no longer exists and that it justifies this sort of bootstrap ideology. So there's lots of ways we can sort of pick at this myth, but I wanted to see if you guys wanted to weigh in on this particular narrative and share some examples or stories.
I was just going to mention that, Asians have fit very well into the framework of capitalism, in the sense that, we have a huge mass of people that are willing to work hard. They, started off working cheaper. As you're talking about, like, not advancing in the ranks, you have people that have the ability to do a lot of work and have been undervalued generally. And that has been kind of the framework of what our country in a way has been built on, the aspirations of freedom and opportunity for everyone. But yet with capitalism, you try to take advantage of people where you can to make the most amount of money. for more work. And Asians have kind of fit that bill quite strongly.
Yeah, I think you're right, Kim. It's always so interesting to look at a chart and then to talk about money and poverty level, because I would imagine, that at least for someone coming here from their country, if they're a refugee, or they're usually coming with nothing, right? And so this coming to America, where the minimum wage, or there's jobs right now for $15, $20 an hour, is like a lot, and can be, maybe someone like that may not see it as poverty if their quality of life has come up a decent amount. So it's always interesting to talk about, where salary rise and that, and how that lines up with other groups.
Yeah, and I think that highlights again, how you're entering the story as well, what those numbers mean.
Right. Yeah. Because my sister and I, we're my parents. I've always thought selfishly, in college and grad school, I was really proud when I was in my early 20s, like, yeah, I'm the first in my family to get a college education. I'm the first to get a master's degree. Yeah, I'm doing this. I'm paving the road for the next couple of generations. And then about a year ago, I had the realization that I wasn't the first, that it was actually my parents who have been able to open up and carve this road for me. If I had come here with nothing, there was no way I would have been able to afford conducting master classes, a master's education at a conservatory. It wouldn't have been possible. And so now, my sister and I make more money now than my parents did at their age. So it's always it's where you are in the story, right? It's exactly what you said, Sarah. It's where you come in, and yeah, it's fascinating.
Yes. All right, let's go to our third part. All Asian American families are sailing off smoothly after they migrate to the US. And this is really speaking to the more immigrant experience. They've overcome hardship, oppression, discrimination. And I think, Kim, you mentioned this, many Asian Americans have left countries involuntarily as refugees or war-torn countries. They might not have been prepared for the US when they arrived. And these are some of the sort of stressors that research indicates are fairly typical in recently immigrated Asian American families. Acculturative stress, basic survival and adaptation in the US, language skills, having kids broker for their parents, to speaking English to teachers and doctors, transportation for daily living, concern about their just health and well-being and their future in the US, concerns about family that were left behind if they'll ever see them again, ongoing discrimination and microaggressions, and economic well-being. So there's a lot of different types of stressors on this map. So I'm just going to hold this up because I think our next slide was just to sort of check in to see if you wanted to share about anything that resonates with you on this map before we kind of move to a little more detail on acculturative stress and PTSD and things like that. But
I could see when I look at this, I think of my mom, especially with the language skills, because it's a struggle. Sometimes it puts a struggle on our relationship, because sometimes I get frustrated with her, and I Mom, stop asking me how to spell the word stop. Sound it out, please. It's like. And then I have to catch myself and just remind myself that this is her second language. And that, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. This woman owns her own restaurant and has been able to get by with not being able to speak English very well. But that I think it sort of plays into that grit and that that immigrant sort of work ethic coming from nothing and sort of pushing through. But yeah, I mean, we don't talk much about stressors. My mom and dad or any of my relatives. So it's always a topic to bring up, and I'm sure there's actually a question in the that someone asked about bringing up if someone who isn't culturally Asian, but who's been adopted and sort of is raised by an adoptive family and isn't culturally Asian, how do you talk to this about them? And something I need to work on more with my parents is to ask, open-ended questions to get them to open up and tell stories. Or how does it feel for this? Or have you ever experienced racism? Or what does that look like? Or what was it like coming over here? And all these questions I've been asking, more so my mom, because we've been spending more time together during the pandemic. But I realized that as an adult, a younger adult, I'm reflecting more and I'm less scared to ask about her experiences. But the stressors are definitely real. I also see myself in this. I'm like, okay, man, I could see it. I'm still struggling with all these. But I think everyone can relate to this roadmap, whether you're Asian, white, black.
My grandpa didn't speak of his hardships very much. My dad didn't hear too much of it. It was only until later in his life that he started opening up about his experiences in camp. They're very, very, something happens, you kind of put it under the rug, just sweep it under the rug and just make sure everything looks tidy and neat. And no one needs to know that there's a problem or a crack. It's kind of a cultural issue. I had a director that would always tell me, don't be so Japanese in that, like, allow the problems to come out. It's okay. You don't have to just try to put everything into a little box and keep it neat. He started painting murals of Heart Mountain on the wall at his house. He would, build Japanese Toro lanterns and things like this, that he would put up everywhere. His parents never spoke English, so he grew up in a household that only spoke Japanese. Yet he only made it through high school in the U.S. As an American because of the war. So he never had a college education, and once the war was over, everything was about survival. And so when they had the farm, they had no money. The Japanese internees were given $25 and a train ticket once the war was over. So from that, how do you start life? Everything you had was taken away from you. You have no possessions, you have no land. You were not even allowed to own land before, too. And so their first thought was, how do we turn this into money? So they thought, what would a crop look like that we could mature in about 80 days and just start selling? So they would just rotate through crops that they could sell, plant, raise them, sell, just to start making money. And yes, multi-generational, they had my great-grandparents there, my grandparents, my grandpa's brother and his family. They ended up getting a house on the other side of the farm. So it was two brothers farming the farm with houses on each side of the farm. And education became very important for my dad and his brother and sister, because either they had to work on the farm or they can go to school. And no one wanted to work on the farm. because it was hard work. And so everyone went to school for as long as they possibly could, so they didn't have to be on the farm. But yeah, I was lucky to come out of a family that, was very, very close in that sense too. But, they didn't really speak about how hard it was for them when they were coming out.
Yeah, and I think that's something that strikes me about both of your stories is silence, and how hard it is to talk about some of these really difficult things or struggles, not just even within your own family. And that kind of highlights, I think, Kim, what you were talking about even at the start of the webinar about being silent and not complaining and not speaking up about things that aren't okay. So I'm going to just highlight a few more. This is just a little more detail about different types of acculturative stress. And I think we've covered a lot of that, but there's lots of stressors, anti-immigrant sentiment, PTSD if you're coming from war-torn countries, a lot of family issues because parents and children have different acculturation rates. And so there's tensions often within families, and even just tensions due to normal stressors of all the transitions of moving and like learning a new language, starting a new business, all these kinds of things. So financial stressors, I think the most interesting study that I came across was some marital stressors, and when deciding on how much money and to which side of the family to send money to, if you're supporting aging parents, particularly in another country. So there's all different types of stressors that would counter that myth that, they're just problem-free immigrants and they're just sailing forward with no issues, because some of those outcomes are emotional distress, depression, it can impact on academic functioning, etc. Okay, so I think our last check-in point is, what is the impact? I know we just have a few minutes because I know we want to set up some time for discussion. So I want to highlight this thing that you brought up at the start, that at a fundamental core, the myth is divisive. It has been used as a trope to create racial divides among racial and ethnic groups and pit them against each other. Because if you have a model minority, that simultaneously implies that there are unworthy minorities that aren't models. So you have this sort of foil. And if you portray Asians as quiet and submissive and hardworking, that don't instigate troubles, that allows you to then depict African Americans as loud troublemakers who are on the streets fighting for social justice. And so that really diverts the attention from fighting institutional racism and structural inequality and diminishes other racial and ethnic group demands for social justice. So I know that's a mouthful, but I think that kind of was linking to maybe what you were chatting a little bit about, Kim, this idea of, staying quiet, not expressing grievances. And when we look at that in the context of 2022, anti-Asian harassment and hate crimes frequently have gone underreported or unreported. Because of that, you just need to keep quiet, don't make any trouble sort of thing. So before we open, I think I'm going to we have more slides than we need to. Just want a final weigh in on both of you on any sort of lingering things you want to chat about before we open it up for the Q&A. And if you've got some questions, start putting them into the little spot at the bottom so we can start chatting. But I'd love to hear Norman and Kim, any sort of ideas on this last idea that this model minority myth is divisive, or some of the costs. I'll just leave this up because this is sort of a summary slide of some of the costs of the myth to Asian American communities.
I'll mention, that after the internment, there were several Japanese that have been very vocal about any racial issues like Guantanamo Bay, like actually taking Muslims and putting them in a prison without due process. And they were able to use their experiences to stand up to Congress and say, this is not okay. This, you've already done this, we cannot keep going back here. This tends to be something that we have an issue with in this country with always trying to do. I mean, sorry, that's not quite here. I was trying to take a slightly separate direction, but it tends to be a cycle that we keep going through. Whenever there's an issue, it's easy to just pin it on a group that doesn't look like you. And or doesn't look like what the typical American is supposed to look like, possibly in quotes. And so, it's starting to change the myth, the model of minority. I think it's starting to break down where people are more willing to stand up and say something a little bit more freely. Slow process.
That was great thoughts, Kim. It's like I said, it's hard. It's really hard and difficult to put into words how I feel about the model minority myth, because I personally have not in my adult life have experienced at least any outward racism directed towards me, and it's hard to, whenever this information or data comes up of all the terrible things that are happening to people, it really puts me in it's a downer to hear all of that. And it's sad that this is happening to so many people, especially more so in places where there is a larger population of Asians in New York and the West Coast. So it's really difficult to hear to think about and express. My mom is this small little tiny Taiwanese woman who the restaurants that she's owned has been a barbecue restaurant, and she now owns like a Southern cooking meat and three place. So that is definitely not the model minority myth, but it's always so interesting to think about this and try to put into words for other people too. The folks who are listening is how do I hope this conversation is people are able to take away or at least hear different stories of what our experience is like.
I had mentioned to Sarah earlier when we chatted the first time how sometimes it didn't fit in. Like when I first started music, I was told not to be too Asian because I would only get cast as Suzuki, and that would be my whole career. So once I did a couple Suzukis, don't do any more Suzukis because that's all you're going to do. And then at some point I became too white and I wasn't Asian enough. And so then like I kind of got in that weird push. So not fitting into either camp is also a feeling of being where we are at as well.
It's really, the classical music world is so bizarre too. I don't know if you've experienced this, Kim, but when, or what your thoughts on this, but I feel like in the orchestra world, I'm not sure if it's as prevalent in the opera world, but it's so, I think administrations and people are so, they try to classify and identify different races and groups, and so when the whole lid blew up a year and a half ago during the Black Lives Matter movement, and the music industry was like, we need more diversity, and it was so tricky because what I felt like what people meant based on what was happening and what the hires that were happening was like, oh, the orchestra world or the music world, when they say diversity, they mean darker skin. That's what they mean, and I thought, well, where do Asians fit in people of color? I was like, am I a person of color? Because I don't have, and then and then when we had the AAPI, you know, that was a new label that was new, and oh, I'm AAPI now. I'm not a person of color. I have to say AAPI, but and so all it's almost like, and sorry if well, it's almost like we're becoming too. We say something and then we have to backtrack and like include this group of folks, and it's just such a bizarre thing. I don't know if you've felt the same way, Kim, but that's been my experience the last year and a half. I think is like, man, where do I fit in on all this? You know, and being biracial too. That's a different thing, and it's because I should mention that my mom is Taiwanese, my father is Vietnamese. I grew up culturally full Asian, but I'm half, and which I didn't find out till later in my life. We won't go into that now, but it was just such a big identity crisis. I don't know if you felt an identity crisis in the last year and a half, but that's my experience.
No, I mean, it's true. I mean, you know, at some point, street scenes, how are you going to cast that? I mean, every single character in that is given a specific race. I mean, unless you you cast each person by specifically, you know, we've gotten to a very, very much, but all Asians can get cast in every Asian role. It's not, that's, you know, as we've kind of already talked about, you know, Asians end up getting grouped into any Asian, but then, you know, again, that's not all we want to portray. You know, we don't want to just have to sing Asian roles, or, you know, everyone. I love like a show like Bridgerton, where they've just given, they're like, everyone can play every role. It doesn't matter what you are at all. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't need to make sense. It's stage. It's meant to be imaginative. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's interesting. I've been asked if I've been made to look Japanese on stage. I walked into an audition. They said, "Have you ever been made to look Japanese?" And I said, "Don't know how to answer that, but if it helps you, I am." And that used to be a normal question. I'd walk into an audition, and the first thing they'd ask me was what my ethnicity was. I played around with it a lot because my white side is very diverse. It's you know, German, Welsh, Irish. So I used to say Japanese and German because that's the majority, but then that was not interesting. So then I started coming in with like, I'm Welsh and Japanese, and people were like, "That's cool." Like,
so Norman and Kim, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at some of the questions over in the Q&A. Are there any ones over there you want to jump in on and or address?
I think the first one's really interesting. Yeah. What comments or suggestions do you have for people who are genetically Asian but adopted into Caucasian families? They are genetically Asian but not culturally. I've met a couple of people. I actually recently had a conversation with a twin. She and her sister were adopted from China as babies. And I was like, have you been interested in like going to seek out your birth parents, or what is that like? How does it feel like growing up like that? And, or not like that, but growing up in a Caucasian family. And I think that's exactly how, what I don't know if the person who's asking it is Asian in, who grew up in a Caucasian family, or if they're asking, how do you talk to someone about that, if you're in that situation. But I go back to, you know, ask open-ended question and just be curious. You know, a lot of these topics and this issue, I think are making people a little bit more scared to ask questions and talk, because people feel like they're going to say the wrong thing or ask the wrong thing, or you know, if someone were to ask me like, do all Asians own restaurants, you know, in the South? And I would be like, actually, my parents did, but I know some folks who were doctors or whoever. So I think asking questions and not being scared to ask questions, that's the key, because no one's going to be offended by a question.
Asking a question instead of assuming.
Exactly. Being curious.
there was a question about other countries addressing this issue. Actually, in just reading up through some of this, I didn't even know all the countries that had done basically relocation for Japanese. So Canada actually relocated their Japanese, Mexico, I think Chile, Brazil, Peru, Argentina, all had relocations for Japanese. And I don't think I've ever heard anything like from Canada. I don't know if, even if there was much said after that from them. But yeah, I don't know that too many, I know everyone is having, I think globally, conversations about race and people's ideas and interpretations of what they think different cultures bring or what they are experiencing in each country. There was a documentary 14 Peaks out recently on Netflix. Recommend it. It's about a Nepalese climber, and he's talking about how you have all these Western climbers in, say, Everest, and they get all the press, they get all the attention, they are the ones who conquered it. Yet you have the Sherpas that are climbing these mountains all the time. And it's not a feat for them, it's only a feat for the Westerners with the money who come in and hire these Sherpas to climb. And so he actually climbed it for the Nepalese, and he hired an all Nepalese team. He climbed 14 of the tallest peaks in the world in 7 months. Insane. Everyone said he couldn't do it. And it's an amazing thing to just to bring attention to the Nepalese people and their needs, and that they are people too, also, because they tend to be looked at as just people there to support others. It was I think a very worthwhile watch.
I'll have to check that out. That sounds amazing. Our time together is over.
Everybody so much for joining us. Norman and Kim, thank you so much for your vulnerability that came through in the chat window as well. Just thanking you for sharing your time with us and sharing your experience with us. This is part 2 of a 5-part series that will be continuing next week. It was mentioned a few times in tonight's presentation, but next week's theme is microaggressions. What are they and how do I interrupt them? So apologies that we couldn't get to everybody's questions tonight, but that is great to be curious, and we always appreciate comments. And don't forget to check out the Montana Mikado coming up in February, just around the corner. Kim, we look forward to welcoming you to Bozeman, and Norman, we'll see you around. But thanks again, everybody, for joining us tonight. And please don't forget to check out next week and the following week's continuation of this program. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Sarah, for a wonderful webinar. Thanks, everyone watching. Thanks, Kim. Nice to meet you. Can't wait to see you.
Nice to meet you.